Something happened in women's basketball that nobody saw coming. Not the analysts, not the veteran players, not even the people who'd been covering this league for decades. A single rookie walked through the door, and instead of adjusting to the league adjusted to her. Every rule, every policy, every unwritten code that had governed women's professional basketball for over 2 decades got quietly rewritten. And the people who built this sport with their bare hands are furious about it. But here's what nobody is talking about openly. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a natural evolution driven by fan enthusiasm or market forces acting on their own. What happened to the Wnba over the last 2 years was a deliberate, calculated, and at times ruthless series of decisions made by people in rooms the public never sees. The Caitlin Clark era didn't just happen, it was engineered. And the further you pull back the curtain, the more uncomfortable the picture gets. Because for every highlight reel moment and record-breaking attendance figure, there's a veteran player sitting in a locker room feeling like the sport she gave everything to just traded her in for a newer model. There's a coach who spent a decade building a defensive identity, being told that identity is now bad for business. There's a referee who learned overnight that the way she called games for 15 years is suddenly wrong. And above it all, sitting at the center of a billion-dollar machine she helped build, there's Caitlin Clark herself, the most scrutinized athlete in women's sports, carrying the weight of an entire league's transformation on her shoulders, whether she asked for it or not. This is the story of how one player changed everything and what it cost everyone around her. For most of the WNBA's history, the league operated like a passion project with a budget problem. Teams scraped for sponsorships, television deals were modest, player salaries were so low that most of the league's biggest stars spent their off-seasons playing overseas just to make ends meet. The WNBA survived on the loyalty of its fan base and the dedication of players who loved the game more than the paycheck. Kelly Krauskopf inherited that reality when she stepped into the commissioner's role, and for a while she played within it. But when Caitlin Clark arrived, something shifted in how Krauskopf saw the league's potential. This wasn't just a talented rookie, this was a cultural moment with a price tag attached to it, the kind of phenomenon that comes along once in a generation if you're lucky. And Krauskopf, by all accounts, is not someone who wastes luck. The internal restructuring that followed wasn't announced with a press conference. It happened quietly, through policy changes, through officiation adjustments, through conversations in front offices that never made it to the public. But the people inside the league felt it immediately. The message from the commissioner's office was unmistakable. The WNBA was no longer going to operate like a development league with a social mission. It was going to operate like a major sports property. And every decision, from how games were officiated to how players were marketed, would be filtered through that new lens. For the veterans who had spent years grinding through the old system, this felt like a betrayal. They had accepted low salaries and commercial flights and minimal media coverage because that was the deal. That was what the WNBA was. And now, suddenly, the league was willing to spend tens of millions of dollars and rewrite its own rules, not for them, but for a 22-year-old from Iowa who had been in the league for 5 minutes. The resentment that built from that realization didn't stay in the locker rooms, it spilled out into the public. And Krauskopf, according to multiple reports, had anticipated exactly that. Because here's the cold calculation that sits underneath it all. Krauskopf didn't restructure the league because she stopped caring about the veterans. She restructured it because the numbers left her no choice. Caitlin Clark's games were drawing 10 times the viewership of the average WNBA contest. Her jersey was outselling every other player in professional basketball, men's or women's. Sponsors who had never shown interest in the WNBA were suddenly calling. Television networks that had treated the league as a programming afterthought were offering real money for primetime slots. That kind of commercial gravity doesn't come along twice, and when it does, you either build around it or you watch someone else capitalize on it instead.
Krauskopf built around it, and she did so with a level of ruthlessness that caught everyone, players, coaches, and media alike, completely off guard. When Caitlin Clark stepped onto a professional court for the first time, most people expected a learning curve. The WNBA is faster and more physical than college basketball. Defenders are stronger. The help rotations are sharper. Every rookie goes through an adjustment period, and almost everyone assumed Clark would too. What nobody expected was the degree of physical targeting that followed her from the opening weeks of her first season. It started subtly. Screens that were set a little harder than necessary, hands that found her ribs in transition, shoulders that caught her in the open court at full speed. These are things that happen in physical basketball, and in isolation, none of them are remarkable. But as the season progressed, a pattern became impossible to ignore. Clark was being hit in ways that went beyond competitive defense. Some of the contact she absorbed would have drawn flags in a men's pickup game. On a professional court, in nationally televised games, it was going uncalled. The footage circulated. Fans were furious. Social media spent weeks dissecting clips of Clark getting driven into the hardwood, while referees stood nearby and swallowed their whistles. Former players started speaking out. Media commentators used words like targeted and dangerous, and through all of it, the league office stayed conspicuously quiet. The silence had a logic to it that becomes clear in retrospect. The NBA had always prided itself on being a physical, defensively intense product. The veterans who were making Clark's life difficult had built their entire professional identity on that style of play. Coming out immediately and flagging their behavior as a problem would have meant alienating a significant portion of the league's existing player base, and doing so on behalf of a rookie who hadn't yet paid her dues. The politics of that were complicated. But the business math was not complicated at all. Every time Clark limped off the court or sat out with an injury, viewership numbers dipped. Every game she missed was money the league wasn't making. And Krauskopf, running the numbers in real time, reportedly reached a conclusion that the let-them-play mentality wasn't just bad optics, it was actively costing the league a fortune. The protection that followed wasn't sentimental, it was financial, and the way it was implemented would ignite one of the most divisive internal debates the WNBA has ever seen. What happened next is something the league has never fully acknowledged publicly, but which every player, coach, and referee in the WNBA felt simultaneously. The whistle changed. Not the rulebook, not the official policies, the whistle. And in professional basketball, that distinction matters enormously, because what gets called and what doesn't is the actual reality of the game, regardless of what the written rules say. According to multiple accounts from people inside the league, referees received guidance that amounted to a fundamental shift in how the game would be officiated. The emphasis moved away from physical, contested defense and toward protecting perimeter shooters. Read between the lines, and the message was straightforward. Let Clark play. Let her shoot. Let her handle the ball in space. Anyone who puts a hand on her in a way that limits that freedom is going to hear about it. The impact on veteran defenders was immediate and devastating. Players who had spent entire careers developing the physical, aggressive defensive style that the WNBA had always rewarded suddenly found that style being penalized. Coaches who had built their defensive schemes around bodying up ball handlers and making every catch a battle were forced to scrap years of game planning in a matter of weeks. The adjustment wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Because here's what the new officiating climate actually meant for any player defending Caitlin Clark. A hard foul wasn't just a hard foul anymore. It was a media event. Every flagrant play, every heated exchange, every physical moment that ended with Clark on the floor got amplified across social media within minutes. The defender in question became the story, the villain in a narrative that the league's own marketing operation was quietly feeding. Players started talking openly in post-game press conferences about the psychological weight of guarding Clark, not because of her skill, though that's real enough, but because of what a single hard foul could cost them in terms of public perception.
That psychological dynamic is a masterclass in soft power, and it didn't happen by accident. The league discovered early on that it didn't need to change the written rules to change the game. All it needed to do was change the culture around what was acceptable. The referees were the mechanism, the media amplification did the rest. And within a single season, the WNBA's defensive identity shifted in ways that would have taken a decade to accomplish under normal circumstances.
The coaches and veterans who hated it weren't wrong to be angry. They were watching their sport get reshaped in real time, not through a collective bargaining process or a vote, but through a series of top-down decisions that they had no say in. The frustration was legitimate. But from the commissioner's office, the response was essentially the same as it always was. Look at the ratings, look at the revenue, then tell me again what the problem is. Nothing generated more immediate outrage among WNBA fans than the decision to leave Caitlin Clark off the Team USA roster for international competition. On the surface, it seemed indefensible. Here was the most talked-about player in women's basketball, a generational offensive talent who had broken college scoring records that had stood for decades, being passed over in favor of more seasoned veterans. The basketball argument for including her was obvious. The public reaction was swift and scalding. But the more you understand about how the WNBA's decision-making apparatus operates under Krauskopf's leadership, the more the Team USA situation starts to look less like an oversight and more like a feature. Sources close to the league's inner circle suggested at the time that keeping Clark stateside wasn't just tolerated by league management, it was actively preferred, and the reasons had nothing to do with basketball. The first reason was fatigue management. Clark's first professional season was already one of the most grueling and commercially loaded rookie campaigns in the history of women's sports. Every game she played was a major media event. The travel schedule alone was punishing. Adding international competition on top of that risked running the league's most valuable asset into the ground before the domestic season reached its most profitable stretch. From a pure asset protection standpoint, keeping her home made cold economic sense. The second reason was exclusivity. The WNBA's new television deal partners had paid billions of dollars for access to Clark's presence on the court. Every minute she spent playing internationally was a minute she wasn't generating value for the domestic product those partners had invested in. The league had a financial interest in keeping Clark's most compelling basketball moments happening in arenas that fell under its jurisdiction and inside the games its broadcast partners were airing. None of this was stated publicly, of course. The official explanations centered on roster selection philosophy and the judgment of the coaching staff. But the pattern was clear enough to anyone watching closely. The WNBA was not going to share its most prized commercial asset with any competing platform, even one as prestigious as international competition. Fans felt cheated, and they were right to feel that way. But the decision made a certain brutal sense when you understand the logic driving it. Clark wasn't just an athlete anymore, she was an inventory item, and the league was managing her accordingly. What followed her return to domestic play only reinforced that interpretation. Clark came back to the court with a visible energy and hunger that translated directly into highlight moments and viewership spikes. Whatever debate existed about the Team USA decision, the commercial outcome was exactly what the league had calculated. The most expensive player in women's basketball was refreshed, motivated, and ready to perform. The show went on, and the ratings showed it. To understand why the WNBA's power structure shifted so dramatically so fast, you have to understand what the new television deal actually represents. For decades, the league operated with broadcast arrangements that were modest at best and embarrassing at worst. The WNBA was not a priority for major networks. It aired when nothing more lucrative was available. Its production values reflected that reality, and the players, despite being among the most skilled athletes in the world, were largely invisible to mainstream sports audiences as a result. Then, Krauskopf sat down at the negotiating table with Disney, NBC, and Amazon, and instead of making the traditional case for women's basketball, she showed them something different. She showed them a spreadsheet of Caitlin Clark's viewership numbers. She showed them the jersey sales data. She showed them the social media engagement metrics and the ticket revenue figures, and the demographic breakdown of who was suddenly paying attention to the WNBA for the first time. She made the case not for women's basketball in the abstract, but for this specific commercial moment while it was still at its peak.
The deal that resulted was worth $2.2 billion. For a league that had spent most of its existence wondering if it would survive the next season, that number was almost incomprehensible. It represented not just money, but a fundamental change in the WNBA's status within the American sports landscape. The league was no longer a charity case that the NBA tolerated out of obligation. It was a property that major media companies had decided was worth real investment. But the consequences of that deal went far beyond the financial. The moment those contracts were signed, the WNBA entered a new level of corporate scrutiny. Every player became a brand ambassador for a multi-billion-dollar media property. Every controversial tweet, every heated post-game comment, every locker room dispute was now subject to the same management calculus that governs the behavior of players in the NFL and NBA. The league that had once prided itself on being more accessible, more human, more community-oriented than its male counterparts was now operating inside the same machinery. For veterans who had joined the WNBA precisely because it felt different, that change was jarring. The league they had signed up for valued authenticity and collective identity. The league they were now playing in valued brand consistency and media narrative management. Those are not the same thing, and the players who struggled to make the adjustment found themselves quietly marginalized by an organization that no longer had the luxury of waiting for anyone to catch up. The irony is that the players who adapted best to the new environment were often the younger ones, the rookies and second-year players who had grown up in an era of social media and personal branding and understood instinctively how to operate in a commercially saturated media landscape. The veterans, many of whom had sacrificed prime earning years playing for a league that couldn't afford to pay them properly, were now being told that the way they handled themselves publicly was a liability. The bitterness that produced was real and deep, and it didn't stay hidden. For most of the WNBA's history, one of the league's most persistent and demoralizing realities was commercial travel. While their NBA counterparts flew on private charters to every road game, WNBA players were navigating airport security lines in the middle of the night, getting bumped from overbooked flights, and arriving at road games exhausted from layovers. Players had complained about this for years. The league had always responded with some version of the same explanation. The economics don't support it. We're working on it. Be patient. Then, Caitlin Clark's presence at airports started drawing crowds. Not small, manageable groups of fans, but actual crowds. People camping near departure gates, gatherings that required security intervention, situations that created genuine logistical complications, and in some cases, real safety concerns for players traveling on commercial flights with minimal support staff around them. Suddenly, the economics that hadn't supported charter travel for 2 decades managed to support it almost overnight. The league's authorization of tens of millions of dollars for private travel was presented publicly as a quality-of-life improvement for players. And to be fair, that's exactly what it was. Better sleep, less travel time, fewer physical demands on athletes who were already playing a grueling professional schedule. By any reasonable measure, it was the right call. But the timing made the real driver obvious to everyone inside the league. This wasn't a decision the WNBA had made because it suddenly cared more about player welfare. It was a decision the WNBA had made because its most commercially valuable player needed a safer and more controlled travel environment. The smaller market teams bore the brunt of the cost implications. Organizations that had been operating on tight margins for years suddenly found themselves absorbing significant new overhead expenses without any corresponding increase in revenue to offset them. The league provided some support, but the gap was real and it was felt. Teams that were already struggling to compete with larger market clubs found the financial playing field tilting even further against them. What the charter flight situation illustrated more clearly than almost anything else about this era was the speed at which the WNBA's institutional priorities had shifted. Problems that had been deemed economically impossible to solve for 20 years became solvable in a matter of months once the right commercial incentive was present. For veterans who had spent careers fighting for basic quality of life improvements, that realization stung in a way that went beyond the specific issue of travel. It confirmed a suspicion many of them had been carrying quietly for years. The league's leadership had always had the capacity to do better. They just hadn't had sufficient motivation until now. That realization that the improvements they were told were impossible were actually just deprioritized changed the tenor of the league's internal politics in ways that are still playing out. The trust deficit between veteran players and league management, already significant before Clark's arrival, deepened considerably, and it created a dynamic where every subsequent decision the league made, however reasonable on its face, was now viewed through the lens of suspicion by players who felt they finally understood the criteria that actually drove institutional decision-making.
While the league was renegotiating its television contracts and restructuring its officiation philosophy, Krauskopf was simultaneously pushing forward an aggressive expansion strategy. New teams heading to Portland, Toronto, and the Golden State area, markets that had previously been considered too risky or too expensive to support WNBA franchises, were suddenly deemed viable. The logic behind the expansion timing was not subtle. The league had a narrow window to capitalize on the Caitlin Clark moment, and more teams meant more games, more markets, more inventory, and more commercial opportunities. For current players, expansion meant something very specific and very uncomfortable: expansion drafts. Every time the WNBA adds a new franchise, existing teams are required to make players available for selection. Rosters get picked apart. Chemistry that teams have spent seasons building gets dismantled in an afternoon. Players who had fought for years to carve out a place on a competitive roster suddenly found themselves looking at the very real possibility of being claimed by an expansion team and starting over in a new city with a new organization. The anxiety that produced was palpable across the league. But perhaps nothing generated more internal friction than the way the league began marketing the perceived rivalry between Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese. For years, the WNBA had operated on a core branding principle of sisterhood. Players were teammates first, competitors second. The league actively discouraged narratives that pitted players against each other and emphasized collective identity and mutual respect. That approach had served a genuine cultural purpose, creating an environment where players felt supported by the league even when individual games were fiercely competitive. Under Krauskopf's new commercial vision, that approach was quietly abandoned. The league's marketing operation recognized early on that the Clark-Reese dynamic generated massive social media engagement, drove ticket sales for their matchups, and created a storyline that casual fans could follow without needing any deep knowledge of basketball. It was, from a pure content strategy perspective, exactly what the WNBA needed to break through to mainstream audiences. So instead of quietly discouraging the rivalry narrative, the league began amplifying it. The players at the center of that narrative had complicated feelings about it, as you might imagine, and the players on the periphery of it had even more complicated feelings. Veterans who had spent careers contributing to the league's collective success watched the marketing machine transform two of the league's most prominent young players into characters in a drama that served the league's commercial interests first, and the players' actual humanity a distant second. The language that got used in coverage of their interactions, particularly when those interactions got physical on the court, carried undertones that many players found deeply uncomfortable. The internal conversation about this inside WNBA locker rooms has been frank in ways that rarely surface publicly. Players understand on a rational level that controversy drives engagement, and engagement drives revenue, and revenue drives the salary increases they all need and deserve. But understanding something rationally and accepting the human cost of it are different things. When you're the player being framed as the antagonist in a storyline you never agreed to perform in, the financial logic doesn't make the experience any less dehumanizing.
Krauskopf's team made a calculated judgment that the commercial upside of conflict-driven marketing outweighed the cultural cost, and by the metrics the league uses for success, they were almost certainly right. Attendance was up, viewership was up, merchandise was up. The controversy was working. But the WNBA that emerged from this era was a fundamentally different institution from the one that had existed before, and not everyone inside the league believed that every aspect of that change was positive. Step back from the commercial success story for a moment and look at what this transformation has actually required. A generation of veteran players who built this league from the ground up has been told, implicitly and in some cases explicitly, that their era is over. The skills they developed, the culture they cultivated, the league they sacrificed for, all of it has been reprioritized without their consent. Some of them will benefit financially from the salary cap increases that are coming. Others will age out of the league before those benefits arrive. For the ones in the second category, the math is particularly brutal. The coaches who spent decades developing defensive philosophies and player development systems have had to throw out significant portions of their playbooks and rebuild around an officiating climate that rewards a completely different style of basketball. Some adapted, others couldn't make the transition fast enough and found themselves on the wrong side of the league's rapidly shifting power structure. The turnover in coaching staff and front office personnel since Clark's arrival has been significant, and not all of it has been voluntary.
The referees who had built their professional reputations on a particular understanding of what constituted acceptable physical play are now operating under a different set of expectations. The scrutiny they face has intensified dramatically. In a league that now generates the kind of media coverage that used to be reserved for major men's sports properties, officiating decisions that would have gone unnoticed 3 years ago are now dissected on national television. The psychological pressure that creates is real, and it has changed how games are called in ways that go beyond any specific directive from the commissioner's office. And Caitlin Clark herself sits at the center of all of this, carrying a weight that is genuinely extraordinary. She is simultaneously the most celebrated and the most analyzed player in women's basketball history. Every decision the league makes gets filtered through the question of how it affects her. Every controversy gets connected back to her presence. Every improvement in the league's commercial standing gets attributed to her impact. She is, by any reasonable measure, the most consequential individual in the history of women's professional sports in America. That is an incredible legacy. It is also an almost unbearable amount of pressure for a person who is, at the end of the day, just a basketball player trying to do her job. The question that the WNBA's leadership has never fully answered is what happens when the Clark era ends, because it will end. Not soon, hopefully, but eventually. The television contracts will outlast her career by years. The expanded franchises will still need to fill arenas. The broadcast partners who invested billions in this moment will still expect a compelling product. And the league will need to deliver that product without its most powerful commercial engine running at full capacity. That is the real test of whether what Krauskopf has built is a sustainable institution or an elaborate structure balanced on a single pillar. If the infrastructure she's put in place, the charter travel, the improved production quality, the expanded markets, the mainstream media relationships, has genuinely elevated the league's commercial foundation, then the WNBA will be better positioned to develop and promote the next generation of stars than it has ever been. If the growth is primarily Clark-dependent, then the league faces a reckoning when circumstances inevitably change. The honest answer is that nobody knows yet. The structural improvements are real, the revenue growth is real, the mainstream visibility the league has achieved is real and meaningful. But whether that visibility translates into durable institutional strength or evaporates when the specific individual driving it moves on, that's a question that can only be answered over time. What is clear is that the WNBA is playing the long game in a way it never has before.
The decisions that felt reckless and ruthless in the moment, the officiating shifts, the charter flight policy, the expansion push, the rivalry marketing, were all bets placed on a specific vision of what women's professional basketball could become if it was treated with the same commercial seriousness as major men's sports. Some of those bets are already paying off in ways that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago. Others are still being played out. The veterans who are angry deserve their anger. The players who feel used deserve acknowledgement of that experience. The coaches who had to reinvent themselves deserve credit for adapting under extraordinary pressure. And the referees who are calling a fundamentally different game than the one they were trained for deserve recognition of how difficult that transition has been. None of those things are incompatible with the fact that the league is also, objectively, in a stronger position than it has ever occupied in its history. Professional sports have always been a business first. The WNBA's uncomfortable secret for most of its existence was that it wasn't enough of a business to sustain itself properly. The Caitlin Clark era forced that to change faster than anyone was ready for. The process was messy. It hurt people. It broke things that deserved better treatment. But the league that emerged from it is unrecognizable from the one that existed 3 years ago. And for all the legitimate grievances about how it got here, that transformation carries real possibility. The next great player who enters this league will walk into a better infrastructure, a stronger commercial foundation, and a media landscape that takes women's basketball seriously in a way it simply did not before. Whether they receive the same protection and promotion that Clark received is a question that will reveal everything about whether Clark's changes were structural or situational. Whether the sisterhood that defined this league's culture can be rebuilt alongside the commercial ambition that replaced it is a question the players themselves will have to answer. The WNBA made a bet. It's still in the process of finding out whether it wins, but one thing is already certain. The league that existed before Caitlin Clark walked through the door is gone. What comes next is still being written, and for the first time in a long time, people who had no previous interest in women's basketball are watching to see how that story ends. That might be the most significant thing the Clark era produced. Not the records, not the revenue, not the television deals, the attention. Because in professional sports, attention is the beginning of everything. And right now, the WNBA has more of it than it has ever had. What they do with it is the only question that matters.